You're on your knees in burning sand, the kind of heat that makes the ground feel like a skillet under your skin. Your knees are raw. Your throat is tight because the iron collar around your neck barely lets you swallow. A chain runs from that collar to the next woman, and the next, and the next. 12 of you, all linked together like cargo. You hear someone crying, another woman whispering a prayer in a language you don't even recognize. Everyone's breathing fast, terrified, waiting for whatever comes next. Then a man steps in front of you. His shadow blocks the sun for just a second. That tiny bit of shade feels like heaven, but it lasts maybe half a heartbeat. Because suddenly, hands grab your jaw. Rough fingers force your mouth open. They push against your teeth, your gums, even the back of your throat, like you're an animal at a livestock auction. You gag, but the man doesn't care. He pulls your lip down, studies your eyes, checks your tongue for disease. And that's when the truth hits you. You're not a person anymore. You're merchandise. Just 12 days ago, you were the daughter of a village chief somewhere in the Sahel. 12 days ago, your mother was calling your name in the morning, the way she always did. She's dead now. You watched it happen. And the men with swords made something very clear that day. Keep walking, or join her. In Arabic, there's a word for what you've become now. Jariya. It translates to slave girl. But that translation, way too clean, way too gentle. Because what it really means is that your body now belongs to whoever buys it. Your past is gone. Your future is a price tag. And the place you're being taken to, a place historians would spend centuries trying not to talk about. Because this isn't the slave trade most people learned about in school. This is the Arab slave trade, a system that lasted over 1,300 years, stretched across 3 continents, and swallowed millions of human beings so completely that almost no descendants survive today to tell the story. And once you understand how that happened, how millions of people could simply vanish from history, you'll never look at the past the same way again. Think about that moment again. The girl kneeling in the sand, the chain around her neck, the hands prying open her mouth while strangers decide what her life is worth. That moment wasn't rare. It was routine. Scenes exactly like that played out across Africa for more than 13 centuries. Long before the ships of the Atlantic slave trade ever crossed the ocean, another system was already operating. Older, quieter, and in many ways, even more brutal. Most Americans grow up learning about the Atlantic slave trade, the ships packed with chained captives, the plantations in the Americas, the roughly 12 million Africans transported across the ocean over 400 years. It's one of the darkest chapters in world history. Museums document it, movies portray it, entire school units are dedicated to explaining what happened. But at the same time that system existed, another trade was moving millions in the opposite direction. Starting in the 7th century, shortly after the rise of Islam and the rapid Arab expansions across North Africa and the Middle East, slave routes began stretching deep into the African interior. Caravan trails cut across the Sahara. Trading ports formed along the East African coast. Markets grew in cities like Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, and Zanzibar. And those routes didn't operate for a few generations. They ran for over 1,300 years. From roughly 650 AD to 1900, historians estimate somewhere between 14 and 17 million Africans were captured, sold, and transported north and east into the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula. Some historians believe the true number may be even higher. Because records were messy, entire caravans disappeared in the desert. Countless deaths were never written down. But here's the part that makes this story so haunting. If millions of people were taken for over 1,000 years, you would expect their descendants to still be everywhere today. Look at the United States. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is visible everywhere. Roughly 45 million African Americans live in the country today. Their families, communities, culture, and history all stand as living proof of what happened. Their existence keeps that history alive. Now look across the Middle East. After more than a millennium of importing millions of Africans, the descendants are shockingly few. Small communities in Yemen, scattered groups in southern Iraq, a few thousand Afro-Arabs in Morocco. Tiny populations where there should be millions. So the question historians have wrestled with for decades is simple and deeply disturbing. Where did all those people go? And once you see the answer, you begin to understand why this entire chapter of history faded into near silence. Because the system wasn't just built to exploit people, it was built to erase them completely. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people are not prepared for. Because the way this trade handled men was unlike almost anything else in human history. So here's the part that stops a lot of historians in their tracks. When African men were captured in this trade, most of them weren't simply sold as laborers or soldiers. Instead, because most Arab merchants weren't personally riding into African villages with swords, they weren't the ones launching the attacks. They were businessmen running a trade network that stretched across continents. Instead, they built something far more efficient, an economic machine that pushed African groups to capture and sell each other. Weapons flowed into the continent. European firearms were traded through Arab middlemen. Along with guns came textiles, luxury goods, metal tools, and one item that was incredibly valuable in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, salt. Entire regional economies began to revolve around this exchange. Some kingdoms grew wealthy by feeding captives into the system year after year. Take the kingdom of Dahomey in what is now modern-day Benin. By the 18th century, its rulers organized regular military campaigns not just to defend territory, but specifically to capture prisoners who could be sold into slavery. Further east, the Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled key routes along the Indian Ocean coast. From there, ships carried enslaved people toward Arabia and Persia. Along the Nile corridor, the Funj Sultanate in Sudan became another major supplier. Meanwhile, nomadic Tuareg groups controlled caravan paths that cut across the Sahara itself. Piece by piece, the trade connected regions thousands of miles apart. And the system fed itself. More guns meant more successful raids. More raids meant more captives. More captives meant greater wealth and trade power. It was a brutal cycle that ran for centuries, expanding deeper and deeper into the continent. Most attacks happened just before sunrise. Warriors would surround a village while people slept. Then, when the signal came, they rushed in all at once, fast, loud, overwhelming. Men who resisted were usually killed immediately. Men who surrendered were evaluated on the spot, their age, their strength, their health. Younger, stronger men might be kept alive and marched north. Older men, men considered too weak to sell, were often killed where they stood. But the women faced an entirely different calculation, because traders were looking at them through a completely different lens. Age mattered enormously. Girls too young would need years of food and care before they became valuable. Women too old had less market demand. The so-called ideal age range in many markets was roughly 13 to 25 years old. Old enough to survive the brutal journey ahead, young enough to be used for many years afterward. Physical appearance could also change a woman's price dramatically. Experienced traders understood the preferences of different markets. Certain features, certain body types, even certain regional backgrounds were considered more desirable than others. Women from Ethiopia, for example, were often sold at premium prices across multiple regions. But the most devastating moment often happened right there at the capture site, because that's when families were torn apart. Mothers pulled away from children, husbands dragged from wives, brothers and sisters separated in seconds. People who had lived their entire lives together were suddenly shoved in opposite directions with chains around their necks. European explorers and missionaries who witnessed these scenes later wrote about them in their journals. Many described the same thing. The screaming, the desperate clinging.
parents trying to hold on to their children for just a few seconds longer before guards ripped them away. One missionary later wrote that those sounds followed him for the rest of his life, that even decades later he could still hear mothers calling their children's names in his dreams. And once the captives were gathered, the real nightmare began, because the next stage of the journey wasn't a few miles down the road, it was the crossing of one of the harshest environments on Earth. And for many of the captives forced onto those caravan routes, the desert became their grave. Now imagine this. Picture the distance from New York to Denver, roughly 1,800 miles across an entire continent. Now imagine walking that distance, not in sneakers, not with a backpack and water bottles, but in chains, barefoot, starving, surrounded by guards who will abandon you the moment you slow down. That's the kind of journey many enslaved Africans were forced to make across the Sahara Desert. The trans-Saharan slave routes connected the interior of Africa to massive markets in cities like Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, and Marrakesh. Some caravans traveled more than 2,000 miles, and the trip could take 2 to 3 months if everything went right, and almost nothing ever went right. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. During the day, temperatures can shoot past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand itself gets so hot it can blister bare skin. Sometimes travelers walked hundreds of miles without seeing a single tree. Then night came, and the same desert that roasted people alive during the day could drop close to freezing after dark. The temperature swing alone killed many captives who were already weak from hunger and exhaustion. But the worst problem was water. Water was life in the desert, and it was rationed with brutal logic. Camels had to survive. Camels carried the goods. Camels were expensive. Slaves were replaceable. So the camels drank first, the guards next, and whatever tiny amount remained might be given to the chained captives walking behind them. People's lips split open until they bled. Tongues swelled inside dry mouths. Some captives became so desperate they tried to lick dew from the sand before sunrise. Food wasn't much better. Most caravans handed out small amounts of dried dates or scraps of meat, just enough calories to keep people walking, never enough to keep them healthy. After weeks under those conditions, bodies started giving out. Historians estimate that 20 to 30% of enslaved people died during Saharan crossings. In some caravans, the losses were even worse. There are documented cases where half the captives died before reaching the markets. And when someone collapsed on the trail, the caravan didn't stop. Stopping meant slowing down. Slowing down meant risking everyone else. So people who couldn't keep walking were simply left behind. Sometimes they were already dead. Sometimes they were still alive, too weak to stand, watching the caravan disappear into the horizon while they waited for death to come. Over time, the routes across the Sahara became marked by something chilling. In the 1850s, a German explorer named Heinrich Barth crossed parts of the desert and wrote about what he saw. He described stretches of the trail where the ground was literally scattered with human skeletons, skulls bleached white by the sun, ribs half buried in drifting sand. In some valleys, he said, there were so many bones it was nearly impossible to walk without stepping on them. And these weren't ancient remains. Many were recent, evidence of caravans that had passed just months or years before. Other travelers reported similar sights. One French explorer wrote about areas where the sand looked pale from a distance, but when you got closer, you realized it wasn't sand at all. It was bones. Hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions over centuries, left behind along those desert paths, their bodies becoming silent markers of a trade route that stretched across Africa for more than 1,000 years. But for the captives who somehow survived the heat, the thirst, and the endless walking, reaching North Africa didn't mean freedom. It only meant they had made it to the next stage, because waiting for them on the other side of the desert were slave markets that had been operating for centuries, places where human beings were bought and sold with terrifying efficiency. So after months and